Alright guys, we're here to finish up the last part of chapter 6. So we're going to look at enzymes in this one. Enzymes are going to be biological catalysts. Anytime you talk about a catalyst, they're typically going to do two things for you. They're going to reduce the energy of activation, and they're going to, by doing so, increase the reaction rate, because it's going to be easier to make the reactions occur if it takes less energy to get them going. That means that the same amount of energy from the surroundings can make more of these reactions take place because it's spread out over a larger subset of molecules, which we'll call substrate molecules, which are the ones being reacted. So I like to think of this in terms of like money, where if all the items cost $2, you ultimately can buy a lot more than if all the items you're purchasing are $10. And so that's basically what enzymes are doing. Now it's important to realize that enzymes don't actually provide energy. So if we're talking about these guys, they're not going to give anything energy. What they're going to do, let's use capital E for energy, is they're just going to typically grab hold of that molecule and they're going to change shape. They're proteins, so they do a really good job of changing shape, and this is why their shape is so important, because each enzyme is going to fit a specific substrate, and then once that substrate or substrates, sometimes they're building instead of tearing apart, binds, they're going to shift a little bit usually, and it's going to put stress on that molecule either to try to bring it closer together to make it want to bind more easily with less energy, or it's going to put some stress on it, kind of like if you have a pencil and you're putting some stress on it by pushing up from below, where it's not breaking yet, but it takes very little extra energy to make it break. And so it's not providing energy at all. That's a common misconception. It's just making it where you need less energy to get it started, and then that will increase the reaction rate because now it does require less activation energy. So substrate, this is ultimately what's being acted upon. So this is the stuff that we are going to either be splitting apart, or it's the stuff that we are going to be sticking together, depending on what type of enzyme it is. Just like when we talked about the various metabolic reactions, in some cases they'll be catabolic, where we're pulling them apart. In many cases they'll be more anabolic, where we're sticking them together. Just about all the reactions in our body chemically are going to have these enzymes, these biological catalysts involved. So we can always just write biocatalysts. And that's somewhat significant, this idea of catalysts, because not only do they lower the activation energy, but they're also going to not be used up. So these guys stick around. You can keep using them over and over and over and over again. In many cases, towards the end here, we'll talk about just how we try and get rid of them, because sometimes they're kind of sticking around and we no longer want this reaction to occur. So we actually have to find ways to shut them down, because once you make them, they just kind of go. It's not like they do one reaction and they stop. Each time they do a reaction, they end up just like they started at the end of it. And so that means they can move on to the next substrate and they can just keep going. The active site is going to be the region where the substrate binds, so the substrate will essentially fit into the active site, and I'm going to show you guys pictures coming up in a second, but this is going to be the part of an enzyme, where you're going to have the substrate bind. There can be plenty of other parts of a specific enzyme, which is just once again, it's a type of protein. There can be other parts. There's nothing wrong with that. There can be several subunits. The active site is just that one subunit where you actually are going to attach. Kind of like you might park in your garage. That doesn't mean that your whole house and yard and everything else is part of that garage. It's not. Your garage is one small part of what you own when you have a house and a yard and a driveway and all that stuff. But it has a specific purpose, and it's the only part of your land that you own that has that specific purpose. And so this active site will be a very important part of the enzyme. In many cases, you could tweak the other parts of the enzyme safely, so long as you don't mess with the active site. This is the major piece where if you screw this up, you've got big problems. And this idea where the active site is very specific for the substrate, so I'm just kind of going to draw that arrow there and see if I can fit in specific. That is going to be the induced fit model, where the enzymes will have a specific active site that only fits in a specific substrate or specific substrates that it wants to attach. And so that's the idea of lock and key. When you have a lock, there's a key that fits it, and that's it. When we talk about our bodies, we don't have like one mega super universal enzyme that does all these different reactions. What we have is thousands of different enzymes, each of which does one specific reaction, which itself may be part of a series of reactions. So to go to completion, to go from A to E, we might need 4 different enzymes, each doing one step of this process. Much like if you're trying to walk up the stairs, you do it one step at a time. And so you could think where like each enzyme would be one of those steps, and it would always be the same step. And so when you put all the enzymes together, you eventually get to where you want to be, which would be the top or bottom of the steps, depending on where you're starting. Moving on here, this is going to show us exactly what the enzyme does. So right now, originally, with no enzyme involved, this is the activation energy right here. All right. So we ultimately need, if we're just going by bars here, if you look at this graph, the graph goes kind of flat lines, then it goes up 1, 2, 3, 4, 5 bars. And so that's our activation energy. Now, this is an exergonic reaction, so ultimately we come down what looks like more like, I don't know, 13, 14 bars. So we get back our activation energy plus this extra, and that extra we get back will be our negative delta G. That's the free energy we get from this. But the idea here is if I add in the enzyme, it now makes it where I need about half as much energy to activate this, about 2.5 bars. And so what that means is if the environment is not as hot, if the environment doesn't have as much as far as molecular collisions going on that can provide this activation energy. It's kind of like having a rock there that's on a slight incline, where if you can get it going initially, it takes a lot of effort to do that, but once it gets going, it just keeps going. Or sometimes a car, you'll have this, where people are trying to push it. And once you get it going, oftentimes it can pick up speed and go on its own pretty good, but getting it initially started is difficult. And so the enzyme just makes it a lot easier to initially get it started, so reactions that otherwise would not have enough energy in the surroundings to get started can do so. And so if more of these things can get started, you're going to have more reactions go to completion, hence you're going to have a higher reaction rate. So that's what this is showing us here. And then this is just another one with some pictures, and you can see this is the active site, so it's just the round site or roundish site, and you can see the substrate is shaped to fit into that active site. And so when the enzyme is there, it kind of shows that this activation energy, that bump that it has to initially go up, is diminished as it fits into this active site, and that helps it, this complex that's formed when that substrate binds to the active site of the enzyme, helps it to go through and eventually give us this end product, which is going to modify our substrate in some way. And the overall process doesn't change. You'll see the starting energy and the ending energy is still the same. The overall, in this case, negative delta G, is still the same. The only thing that differs is it's a heck of a lot easier to get it going than if there was no enzyme, if it was an uncatalyzed reaction. And you'll see too at the end of the reaction, this enzyme looks just the same as it does at the start, so this enzyme is ready to go grab another substrate and start again. This is going to show you one that's going to be breaking something down, so you can see that there's this kind of U-shaped guy and this triangle guy that are binding to the active sites. In this case, the active site's big enough for 2 guys. When they bind, it's going to shift a little bit, and that's going to snap this. And so what we're going to get then is the U-shaped guy goes one way, the triangle guy goes the other way, they're split apart. So this is showing you one that's going to essentially break things apart. They can also work in the opposite direction. There's nothing saying they can't, where they can take the 2 separate pieces, stick them together, so we can go from these 2 different pieces to getting to this one full piece. That can happen too, so don't assume they have to break stuff apart. This one's just intended to show you that when you get a substrate binding to the active site, it typically causes a shift in the conformation or shape of the enzyme that stresses that compound to either make it want to form a bond or want to break a bond. So in this case, you can see that it's fairly wide here at the end, which allows the substrate to get into the active site. And then once it binds to the active site, it kind of shifts where the enzyme in this case kind of grabs hold of that substrate. And so as it shifts and grabs hold of it, that would allow some type of chemical reaction to occur more easily. That's why it would require less activation energy, is that shift in the shape of it. There's one off to the right here that shows the same thing. You can see the angle of this, that it's much more perpendicular. Once this thing binds, the enzyme's kind of folding in, and so that's what's allowing the reaction to occur here, is that change in shape that we see, that change in conformation. But once you finish this, once you actually bind or break apart these things and you release these new products, so substrate came in, products leave, once that happens, that shifts this enzyme right back to its starting position. So once again, even though it does shift its conformation, it does so reversibly. And as soon as the reaction has occurred and it releases those substrates, it's right back to where it started, so it can go straight from finishing one thing straight back to starting the next reaction. Okay, enzyme activity is subject to a variety of things because proteins in general are subject to a variety of things. If you've ever boiled milk, if you've ever cooked egg whites, you'll see that they will change their consistency, they'll change their color, they'll change their taste. And that's because any type of relatively significant temperature or pH changes will make a protein, and remember, enzymes are proteins. All enzymes are proteins, not all proteins are enzymes. They can also be for storage and structure and pigment and all kinds of stuff. But all of our proteins will tend to be susceptible to temperature and pH. And enzymes, because they have that active site that's so important, that's so reliant on shape, will be, if anything, more susceptible than most. And so if you change the temperature, if you change the pH, if you add in things that are reactive, certain ions, etc., you can mess with enzyme function. And what's going to happen is it's going to allow for that tertiary structure to shift a little bit. It's going to allow for some of those hydrogen bonds, those hydrophobic interactions to snap and rearrange. And so by doing so, even if you don't actually change the primary structure, even if you don't actually break the chain in half, which obviously if you add enough heat, etc., you could do that. But even if we make more minor changes just to this kind of higher level structuring of it, secondary, tertiary, quaternary, even if we just mess with that, it will give us different characteristics. And so that's why egg white will go from clear to go to actually being white. That's why milk will have a different consistency. I believe it cuts thinner in some parts, thicker in others when you boil it. That's because you're changing these conformations of the enzymes. This is also why you die if you get a fever of 107 degrees. People are like, oh my gosh, my brain boiled. No, your brain doesn't boil at 107 degrees. Things boil at 220 degrees if you're made out of water, and we have ions dissolved in us. And so if you remember from chemistry, boiling point elevation, technically we would boil at even higher temperatures than Fahrenheit 212 or Celsius, which would be the proper one scientifically, 100 degrees. So it would be higher than that. So the fact at what's probably, I'm doing my rough conversions, but in the low 40s is going to be what it is in Celsius, and at a little over 100 degrees, the fact that we can die from a fever is not that our brain is boiling. It's that our enzymes are going to go through this change, this conformational shift, because the temperature is going up. And if your enzymes fail, then it's going to make your metabolism fail. So when temperature and pH are able to change the conformation of your proteins, your enzymes, that can ultimately allow your enzymes to fail. Now, initially, you'll see, and I'll show you on the next slide, there's kind of this rough bell curve type structure. It's not always a perfect bell curve, where as things get colder, it gradually diminishes in how well it works. When it gets hotter, it's usually a little steeper as to how it starts to fail. But there will be periods where it works just not as well. And there will be these periods where it's like the optimum, where you look there and it's where it works best. And it varies. You have some enzymes that work very well, like in our stomach, and they work well at low pH. So I don't want you to think that all enzymes work best at a specific temperature that's like room temperature, or they all work best at neutral pH. There are some enzymes that only work in extremely hot conditions. Some work best at extremely cold conditions. Some work best in between. That's down to evolution selecting based upon where you live, which enzymes will work best for you. So if you get the right mutations that allow you to kind of have the variation to pick between these different enzymes that do a similar task or the same task, to allow for that, you can then select for the ones that best fit what you're doing. So the enzymes in our stomach, where it has low pH, like pepsin, do really well at low pH. They don't do a really good job at normal pH. Whereas in your small intestine, where it's closer to neutral pH, those enzymes function much better at neutral pH. And that works out well for us because that's what it is there. So those will be two things that can really mess with enzymes and mess with you. This is why so many fish and such, acid rain, that's why they talk about it, is because if the pH shifts, aquatic organisms are bathed in that pH. So if pH goes down by just 1, that's actually a 10-time shift, if you guys remember, in the amount of H plus and OH minus. And so that's going to then make it difficult for their enzymes to cope. Many of their enzymes will shift down one of these sides, and they'll become less effective. And if they become not effective enough, it can kill the crustaceans, the fish, the insects, whatever's living there. It's not that they're like burning like the Joker or Two-Face or something. They just have their enzymes fail. Now, cofactors and coenzymes are things that we use to help control enzyme activity. So if we want to kind of shut something down, we can oftentimes remove these inorganic or organic helpers. So cofactors are going to oftentimes be things like metals that we need in small amounts in our body, where the enzyme is going to have a typical, let me draw a really crappy enzyme, it's going to have what we can consider the active site, but it might have where either the active site or a separate site needs one of these cofactors, like a metal, or needs this coenzyme, like a vitamin, an organic small compound, to bind there before it can work. So it's kind of like if you go to a safety deposit box where there's two keys. So the bank has a key and you have a key, and they both have to go in and then it can turn. It's that same kind of idea. So if you want to turn an enzyme off, one way you could do that is to limit the cofactors that are present or limit the coenzymes. And that's why it's also can be dangerous if you lack certain minerals or vitamins in your diet, because those minerals and vitamins can be desperately needed to make critical enzymes function. And if those enzymes don't function, much like getting a fever or hypothermia or getting bathed in a solution that's too acidic or basic, it can shut your enzymes down and it can cause severe problems up to and including death. So those are some ways to kind of control things. This is showing, in this case, pH. So you can see pH here, and this is activity. So this is how efficient that enzyme is. So you can see these things have different peak efficiencies. This one has a peak efficiency, the first one, at probably around 2. So this one is likely going to be somewhere like a stomach. The next one has a peak efficiency of around 7. So that one ultimately is more likely going to be something that could be present in blood, could be present in tears, could be present in your small intestine. This could be a lot of places because it's more like the norm in our body for the most part, barring certain exclusions. And then you'll see the last one has where it's probably around, 12 pH, 11 pH. So this one's going to be used in something basic. There are some bodies of water that tend to be rather basic. That's kind of pushing it. I know some of them are like 10, but there are places that are basic, and so those enzymes would function well with something that has a pH of, that's probably more like 10 or something here. I can't tell exactly because the bottom part's not marked up that much. So each of these suits a specific pH, and if they get too far outside of that pH, they start to become so inefficient that they wouldn't be able to allow enough reactions to occur to likely allow the organism to persist. Now this one on the other side shows temperature. Now this one just shows one enzyme, but you can have others. So I'm just going to show you, like, you could draw one that essentially has this bell curve that's much more gradual on the front than it is on the back. I've told you that heat tends to come down a lot faster function-wise. So when enzymes get too hot, they tend to crash a little bit more than getting too cold. And so there can be other enzymes that do well at colder temperatures. But the enzyme that they have here initially is one that's pretty normal for like body temperature of a mammal or a bird. somewhere around 39, 40 degrees Celsius. So that's going to be somewhere around like 100 degrees Fahrenheit. But there are other organisms that have ones that will be successful and do well even at lower temperatures, or there are some things that live like in your hot water tank. There are some archaebacteria that can live there, and so those guys can do well almost, and in some cases like up to, wow, that is a horrible line I just drew, the boiling point of water. And so when you look at that, they'll have a similar curve where it's kind of gradually rises, then comes down much faster, although that should be a straight line. I just am drawing impaired. And so that one will just be shifted over, so it might be over towards 100 degrees Celsius if it's an organism that is going to live in a hot spring or your hot water tank or whatever else. It could be somewhere that's more like 60 or 80 or even 100 in some extreme cases. And so that just allows them to survive even in those conditions. Now, we can shut things down, we said, and we talked a little bit about the whole coenzymes and cofactors, but there's other specific molecules that this is their job. So they are inhibitors. That's what they do. And they're going to do this in one of two ways, an irreversible way or a reversible way. Now I want you guys to think if something's going to essentially attach to an enzyme, which is what inhibitors do. They're going to stick to it. If I say irreversible, I want you to think for a second about what's likely happening there, what type of interaction it is. It's like Dora, where you guys have to like fill in the blank here. Delicioso. All right, so this one's going to be, if it's irreversible, a covalent bond. I can act like you guys said it even if you didn't. If it's reversible, this is typically going to be more one of those intermolecular attractive forces. So this is more likely to be something like a hydrogen bond, dipole-dipole, something like that. We'll put hydrogen bond because that's a common one that we use, where this is much weaker. You know, it's only probably 5% as strong as a covalent bond. So it's much, much easier for us to remove it versus having something that's covalently bound. And then there's two ways that it can actually attach, competitive versus non-competitive. Now I will tell you, competitive means it's going to compete with the substrate. It's trying to get to the active site. All right, so anytime you see a competitive inhibitor, its goal is to attach to the active site, cross that out, which means that it blocks it because if it's at the active site, the substrate can't get there too. Then there's non-competitive, where there's a separate site. So this is kind of like me and you both run in a room for the light switch. That's competitive. But if we're doing non-competitive, you run for the light switch and I go down to the breaker and I just flip the breaker. And so you have no control. You can sit there at the light switch, you can sit there at the active site, but it doesn't matter because I shut it off at kind of this separate location. And it's a separate location where I don't have to fight with you. It doesn't matter. It's my own place where I can control it completely. And this is how many toxins and poisons work, is they will bind to non-competitively and shut down enzymes, and ultimately that is what can lead to your death. And so this is showing just some of the ways we can mess with enzymes. So this first one is just showing substrate concentration, where if you have very little substrate, the enzymes cannot have very fast rate of reaction because they've got no one to work with. You know, there's very few substrate molecules, so most of these enzymes are forever alone. All right? Now, if we start to add in more substrate, you can see that most of the enzymes are kept busy. And eventually, if we put in lots of substrate, you can see that pretty much all the enzymes are perpetually busy because there's almost always going to be these substrate particles bouncing around. And if there's enough of them, there's almost always one of them that really quickly is going to hit them, bind to the active site, so this process can happen. And then as soon as they react that one, there's usually somebody else to take its place. Whereas at medium concentrations, it's not as frequent, and at low concentrations, it can be rare that ultimately that substrate actually lands and binds to it. So most of the enzymes, even though they're there, are kind of unemployed. And then this is showing the competitive inhibition, where you can see this is our substrate molecule, so it's kind of this, I don't know, it looks like a person where at the shoulders they cut down at an angle, so they have like a triangle into their chest. That's how I will describe it. And so this can bind to the active site that looks just like it. Looks like it fits in there like a key. And once it binds in there, it breaks this molecule into two pieces, a little Pac-Man looking circle and a diamond. Now if I put in this inhibitor, you can see it has a different shape, but it does have the same basic shape on the bottom that binds to the active site. So it will bind there and basically just stick and take up the space. So it's not actually going to do the stuff. It's kind of like me going to the supermarket and then just going up to one of the registers and just standing there indefinitely. And so you want to use it, but I got there and I'm just going to stay there, and now you can't use it because I'm there blocking it. That's going to be competitive inhibition. But this one's difficult because you still have where some enzymes are available, and so substrate can still get to some of the enzymes. It's not a perfect way, because when you're competing, the inhibitor's not always going to win. So what we'll see is there's these non-competitive ones, oftentimes called allosteric enzymes, that have this allosteric or separate site. So they still have an active site. In this case, it's the same active site, you can see. But then there's this other place, this other little, I don't know, I guess you could say it's like a little rectangle type piece carved out at a separate site. And there's a molecule, an inhibitor, that can bind to that. And when that inhibitor binds to that allosteric site, what it is going to do is it's going to change the shape of the active site. So you can see here we have a change in shape. And that then is going to make it where the active site no longer fits the substrate. So even if the substrate's there, even if the active site is open, it's no longer the same active site. So the original substrate that would like to bind there to react can't until that allosteric inhibitor is removed. And like we said, in some cases you might shut an enzyme down permanently with an idea of like covalent bonds. Sometimes you're going to do it temporarily, where you use something like hydrogen bonds to hold it in place. But this is ways in which our body can regulate to quit these enzymes, to make these enzymes just slow down or stop. If you want it to slow down, you can ultimately use a competitive inhibitor. If you want it to just stop, you can use one of these allosteric guys that are much more complete, where it's just off. And then obviously if you want to turn it back on, you could take something that will bind and interact with the actual inhibitor, which could then damage and remove that, or just pull it off or whatever, which would then make this go back. So if this particular inhibitor left that allosteric site, that would allow this enzyme to go back to the way it was, and it would go back to being functional. This is just showing you that there's going to be a variety of different ways inhibitors work. It's just showing a different molecule that when it binds to the allosteric site, it's got a piece that blocks the active site. So it's more like a cover. So you snap on this cover so the active site is just not accessible. You didn't change the shape of the active site. You just made it where there's no access to it. And I think that is it for us. I think that's the end of what we have. So as we look at enzymes, just remember once again that shape is going to be critical. Remember, they do not provide energy, but they will lower the activation energy. They do that by having things bind to a specific active site. They then change their conformation slightly to make it where there's less activation energy needed. This lets us do more reactions in a given time. That's called reaction rate. It also allows us to do many reactions that would not occur spontaneously elsewise, because there's not enough energy just in the surroundings to make it get started until you have this extra little way of doing it. I guess it's kind of like a lever. The lever doesn't really provide energy, but it makes it a lot easier to move that rock, because it makes it where it doesn't take as much energy to move that rock. So if you've got this rock that you're trying to push, a boulder or something, if you can get the right lever, you can get that sucker going, because it takes less energy to activate the boulder, to get it rolling. That's the idea we have with enzymes. And with enzymes, you've got to be very careful with pH and temperature, because proteins and their tertiary, secondary, quaternary structure, especially tertiary, is very susceptible to changes in pH and temperature, because those things will interact with the amino acids, with those R groups, or it'll make the molecules move so rapidly that they'll interact differently with each other, and so that can allow us to get different conformations which no longer do their job. And if they're essential, you're screwed. It's just that simple. All right? Hope you guys have enjoyed this. Hope you enjoyed Chapter 6. I will see you guys tomorrow, and we'll pick up with the rest of this. Take it easy.